Good morning, delegates and observers. I'd just like to advise I'm awaiting a quorum to enter the room. You'll be familiar with the fact that no business shall be transacted until a quorum is present. We're getting close, but no cigar. Kate, is there a bell to ring? Rob? I'll just make, this is it, 60. Good, thank you. Good morning, delegates and observers. I'm pleased to advise that I've done the head count and a quorum is present. As I open proceedings, I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome our past President, Dr. Mukesh Haikerwal, who's now been able to join us from an overseas mission. So very good morning to you, past President. I'm advised that we'll resume standing orders. And just at this time, if you just consider your mobile phone. Often when we go out at night, people turn mobile phones onto noisy. So if you could just ensure they're on silent or vibrate, I think that'll extend some courtesy to the speakers. I'd like to advise that the 4 p.m. session today, I'm going to modify so that we'll be running consistent with our Article 34B and provide that as an opportunity for a discussion of current topical issues. We sort of addressed that a little bit yesterday, but I'm prepared to do that. I'll just ask that you'd inform our operations manager, Mr. Huff, by 2:30. That's the end of lunchtime today. And if there is nothing to discuss, I'll so advise. I'd also like to remind you, as this is one of our policy sessions, we're continuing with the use of the modern technology. We'll try to put up on the screen the web link, natcon.ama.com.au. Find this plenary session, come to the bottom of the page and type in your questions, which will be synthesised to present to the chairman. And speaking of whom, I'd like to now take the opportunity to invite Professor Paul Komisarov to the lectern to convene the session.
Thank you, Rod, and hello everybody. Welcome to this session on the challenges faced by doctors caring for patients at the end of life. My name's Paul Komisarov. I work at Monash University. I'm a physician and the director of an ethics centre there. This session's been organised by the Ethics and Medico-Legal Committee of the AMA, of which I'm a member, and I'm honoured to have been asked to chair it. The purpose of the discussions here this morning is not to arrive at definitive outcomes and certainly not to formulate a policy, but it's part of an ongoing process of exploring the issues on the way to those goals. The problem that we've posed has been stimulated by recent public debates about management of care at the end of life. Typically, these focus on legalisation of euthanasia and the establishment of a universal regime of advance directives. Rather than address these issues directly, and some of them have been considered at previous national conferences, We've chosen to open up the discussion to consider the underlying assumptions, problems, complexities and concerns in order to rethink the role of the doctor in these difficult circumstances. What we're not discussing is whether people's wishes about where and how they die should be respected. We're taking this for granted as an assumption of the entire conversation itself. It's obvious that such wishes are not always honoured, and that's regrettable. Also, there's intense public debate about whether doctors or others should actively be involved in killing people. We acknowledge these debates, but they're not the subject of our discussions this morning. Each of the speakers will present his or her own point of view, but before getting underway, I want to list 4 key points of my own, which you might like to take into consideration as you listen to the talks and formulate your questions, which you can send to me for the discussion which follows. First, we need to think about the underlying philosophical assumptions which motivate or guide the discussion. Here, what's taken for granted, usually without explicit reflection, needs to be made explicit. For example, much of the public debate about decisions about dying, including advanced directives and euthanasia, departs from a point of view that assumes a concept of personhood and autonomy, in which individuals are understood as radically isolated from others and as making decisions on the basis of purely rational principles. It's important to recognise that there are other ways of understanding the nature of personhood, and that these may have important consequences for how we make crucial decisions. Some of these issues will be discussed during this session. Secondly, in our work as clinicians, we often see people dying and in pain. Although some people may ask for assistance in dying, there can be no doubt that the vast majority fight to stay alive. Care of the dying, including responses to both mental and physical pain, is often handled poorly, with lasting, painful results for family and other carers. This is in part because of a lack of knowledge and understanding by professional carers and of insufficient community resources to support and develop the services that they offer. Included here is how to address the manifold issues of meaning, grieving, emotions, memories, regrets and fears that shape the rest of the lives of those who are touched by the death of a loved one. In these cases, to focus on devices such as changes in the law or written protocols, as if they were on their own the solution to the problem, may fail to understand the deep complexity of the process of dying for the large number of people who are affected by a single death. Thirdly, we're all very much aware of rising anxiety about the so-called ageing society and the problems associated with the risk of dementia amongst people in the society. In response to this anxiety, powerful pressures are building up to cut healthcare costs by reducing expenditure in the care for the elderly, because this is where most money is spent. Multiple campaigns of various kinds have developed to limit access to investigation and treatment for old people. Many of these are presented under the guise of respecting autonomy and promoting dignity and freedom. We need to be very careful to avoid the development of a culture that regards elderly people as not deserving of or entitled to care. And finally, there is in our society a lack of respect for and understanding of elderly people, especially those with cognitive impairment, as well as a deep fear of finding ourselves lonely, depleted and abandoned in old age. Here it may be that what's needed is not to stigmatise elderly people, but to learn how to talk with and to listen to them. It's even possible that in doing so we may gain access to deep fountains of wisdom and creative insight previously invisible to us that can enrich our lives and those of the whole community. This indeed has been my own personal experience with my own mother. So, how do we move forward? And how do we develop the deep and deepen the contributions of doctors in caring for patients at the end of life? These are the questions that we're seeking to consider during this session. We have 3 speakers, each of whom has a distinctive perspective and body of experience to draw from. Our first speaker is Professor Peter Saul, who's an intensive care specialist and the director of a private intensive care unit. And much of Peter's work involves advising state and federal governments in relation to end-of-life issues. At the end of the 3 speeches by the 3 speakers, we'll move into a discussion session, and I invite you to send through the mechanism that you're well aware of any questions that you may have, which we can then put to the speakers in the conversation that follows. Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. In fact, I think there's a lot of people out there who pay me to shut up. But I would say that I'm not speaking on behalf of any state or federal government when I make these comments. And my first point is my only point. So I'll spare you all the misery by giving you the bottom line straight away, which is there's always an easy solution to every human problem: neat, plausible, and wrong. The solutions to the problem we're talking about, improvement of end-of-life care, are neither neat nor easy, but solutions there are, and we're really obliged to try and pursue those. So I apologise that this will sound complex, but if it doesn't sound complex, I'm afraid I'm not doing the right job here. As Paul said, there is a sort of gathering cloud, at least in the popular imagination, about what people like to refer to as the tsunami of dementia, which is an image that I don't like at all, for obvious reasons, but also a very quite rapidly aging population. And while one can't put too much on that, the truth is there is an aging demographic, and we can't ignore that. And this aging demographic has changed the nature of end of life in a single generation in ways that none of us could even begin to imagine would happen. For instance, at this point, now that 90% of Australians, of course white Australians, live to be old, the way in which they then come to die, in which we all come to die, has radically changed over the past generation. So when I was a kid, the nature of people's dying was unrecognisable in comparison to what it is now. And if you use the standard cartoons of trajectories of dying, the sudden deaths that were so much part of literature in the past, the death of little Nell, etc., really aren't any longer the nature of dying. And if you go to the bottom right-hand corner of that, the increasing frailty is really probably going to become the dominant mode of dying in years to come, and that's what we've all got to look forward to. The problem with which is that the underlying treatments that we might do to try and restore health are increasingly unsuccessful in a frail population. And frailty alone, or sarcopenia, will turn out to be a very major issue that we should look for in patients that are admitted to hospital or that we see in general practice. And commonly there will be these episodes of organ failure which will result in multiple admissions to hospital, all of which there will be contested decisions to make about whether or not this should be treated aggressively or not. And the irony is that part of the complexity of this is that the 90s and early 2000s probably saw rising expectations from people about the capacity of healthcare to cure all ills. But in fact, many of the people that we now face will not be cured by the same mechanisms that we saw in the 90s in intensive care, for instance. So people now talk about, we'll find a cure for dementia. Well, the lead time for dementia is about 25 years, and there isn't even any agreement about what it is. So I think to start talking about the cure for dementia is actually a 90s notion that we're provoking into the 2013s. And as Paul mentioned, there's been this fascinating, quite recent rise in the notion of patient autonomy, which really is actually quite a crude notion, the way we've taken it on, also quite a recent notion, and really was based around some high-profile cases in the US in the 1970s. And this idea that the patient should choose their own treatment and make their own decisions and so on is actually a relatively recent one and has been grossly oversimplified for popular consumption and doesn't actually bear much relation to reality. And the real problem with it at end of life is that relatively few patients are in a position to determine what happens to them when they come to the end of their own lives. Between 30 and 80% of people will actually lack the capacity to make decisions when it becomes their turn to die during their terminal illness. So it's quite a problematic issue at end of life. The upshot of all of the changes that I've very briefly sketched there, but the reason I've been brief is that I imagine that we're all on the same page with what those changes have been. The upshot of all that is that most Australians now die in acute care hospitals, and in the much neglected private system, private hospitals have also become a favoured place of dying as well, particularly in New South Wales and South Australia, to the point now where something of the order of 60% or more of Australians now die in acute care. If you compare that, we don't have this kind of data for Australia, but this is Ireland. This is 120 years of dying in Ireland. And as you can see, around the time I started grammar school was where people mostly started dying in institutions rather than at home. So as a kid, my grandmother used to lay out the people in the street, and I used to walk past dead bodies in her front room as a regular thing, but that became very different as time went by. And there's some literature on that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about literature because these are short speeches. But there is some quite good data gathered in Western Australia that show that the experience that I'm talking about is in fact a reality for a majority of people. All of the people that they followed in this study were eligible for palliative care, but in fact spent all their dying process in and out of EDs and in acute care hospital. In our own institution, 1 in 4 of the people who die on our campus die in the intensive care unit, and 1 in 3 of the ones who don't die in ICU we see and manage their dying process as a rapid response team. And although Paul makes the very important argument that this isn't about finance, we've got literature now from New South Wales which show that while famously healthcare costs are mostly in the last year of your life, we have data saying it's actually the last 30 days where much of the healthcare in that last year is spent. And the trauma is a particular issue. The heroic battle is a very expensive process. More cogently and much more importantly from my point of view, we're mostly in this room destined to die in acute care hospitals. I apologise for that. But what I mostly apologise for is that acute care does not manage end of life well. In fact, acute care manages end of life extremely badly. And audit data done by, among others, by Paul Komisarov's team in Melbourne shows some very dismal stories about what it's like to die in an acute care hospital, where decisions are left until the very last minute. Until you've stopped breathing, people don't really see it as your end of life. And as Cicely Saunders pointed out to us many years ago, how we die remains in the memories of those who live on. We have a responsibility to try and improve that experience because that's what lives on in the memory of others. And much of the oxygen that's being given to the euthanasia debate is because of bad experiences of dying that people have experienced in other places. Australia has one of the highest levels of support for euthanasia in the world, second only to Switzerland, where it is legal. The problem with acute care is it runs on a series of defaults. The defaults are protocolized defaults, ED defaults, treatment defaults, which work very well for heart attacks, chest pain, and so on. But for end of life, they're absolutely dismal because there are no defaults set up to deal with end of life, and end of life is not an anticipated outcome of an acute care admission. And as the great philosopher pointed out, the great thing about failure is it requires no preparation, which is precisely what acute care currently does. And the reason for that is that acute care does not have a high event rate of death. Less than 2% of patients die in acute care. So although it's the expectation for 60% of the people in this room to die in acute care right now, for acute care, this is a rare event. Less than 2% of people who go into acute care die, and particularly surgical patients who very rarely die under the surgeons. So this is not something that we're well prepared for, and there are no systems in place that would assume that on admission to acute care that you might die, and that we should be prepared for that. And one of the real problems in acute care is that hard choices most commonly have to be made. Most people aren't able to make their own choices at end of life, and other people are forced into the position of trying to make a choice for them. Often us, the medical carers, but frequently their own families who may have really little idea about what they're supposed to say or what their moral or legal role is. The solution to all ills in some people's mind is this notion of advanced care directives, which I've spent a lot of time. I chair the New South Wales process for trying to introduce this. There is a national framework which has been signed off by every state and government, but in fact has made a soundless splash, and I would guess that 90% of the people here don't even know this happened. But it tries to harmonise terminology and so on, and it's completely failed to do so. What it says is that there's two possibilities. One is what in New South Wales would be called an advanced care directive, a written instructional directive aimed at future carers, and that's option A. Or option B is some form of appointment of somebody to speak for you. These are the two ways in which you can, to use the words, take control of the end of life. And this is a comment very recently by a Canadian researcher, Darren Hayland, from the CareNet group. Investing in advanced care planning is perhaps the single most important thing we can do as a society. There's a claim that I'd love to see debated, and maybe the panel can get a chance to do that. But nevertheless, it shows that people think that this is an extremely important issue. My own take on it, having researched this endlessly, is that these written directives are highly influential, but they're lopsided in that they always favour no treatment, which is, of course, the only binding thing you can write about. They're actually still rare and likely to remain so because most people don't want things written down. They're generally unavailable at the time that they're needed. We don't have any system in place for asking for them, even if they do exist. We have no way of translating them into a document intelligible to an acute care hospital. And, of course, in the end, they are contestable, and perhaps that's appropriate that they should be. I'm going to say very briefly something about guardianship, which is a very weird proposition that's now taken hold really throughout Australia, the notion that we declare that you have no capacity to make your own decisions, and therefore we will protect your autonomy by appointing somebody to make a decision for you who has no idea what you want. If anybody else can spot the irony in there, I'm sure you're on the game here. The point really is we should not be so hasty to pronounce lack of capacity, but have in place systems whereby we exhaust all possibility to try and communicate with people about what they might want and to support their decision-making in any way we can. The UK Mental Capacity Act demands that, but it's something which is only just now being looked at by the Victorian Law Reform Commission and again in South Australia. But this is called supported decision-making, which again, maybe we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about. Let's not rush to pronounce that people can no longer manage their own affairs. So this is my systems approach, and the meeting talks about health system rather than individual decisions. We were all taught the chain of survival, which is the notional way that you survive from having had a cardiac arrest in the street to being discharged home alive. Something similar has to exist for you to die in the current setting without being treated in a way that's inconsistent with your best interests. I call it the chain of dying safely, and I borrowed the term dying safely from Ken Hillman, one of my colleagues here in Sydney. But it has a number of links, many of which are pre-hospital links. Health literacy is not good about end of life in the community. It's not good among practitioners, to be honest, either. But an improvement in health literacy seems like step one. Advanced care planning is in there, but it would mostly be a community-driven question, and the GP's reluctance to pick up advanced care planning is something that will have to be altered if it's ever going to succeed. The choices have to be documented, and documentation standards need to be looked at. We need to integrate palliative care into acute care and not have it as a separate specialty. I'll be interested to see what Michael thinks. And that we have to have a way of honouring choices that people have made. So I wanted to offer you some tasty take-homes as part of the debate for this meeting. Leaving aside the economic argument, there's really nobody who would dispute that improving end-of-life care is a win-win, in the sense that there are no forms of end-of-life care that are more expensive than dying on the end of a ventilator in an intensive care unit. So there's no way that we could change this in order to make it more expensive. My contention is that earlier discussions make better decisions. And again, the audit that Paul was part of showed that most end-of-life decisions seem to have taken place in the last 24 hours of life, at least in Melbourne. I'm sure that's true here too. Advanced care planning is part of the solution, but we do have to have all the links. So in isolation, getting people to write documents will not help. They'll turn up in an ED, they won't have it, the ED won't ask for it, the ED won't know what to make of it if they do get it. There's no point in putting your eggs in that basket until the links are all in place. The current legislation, and by that I mean the legislations throughout all the different states and territories, urgently needs to be reviewed. Victoria is doing it, South Australia has recently done it, New South Wales is determined not to do it for reasons which we can only guess at. But there is clearly a need for legislation to send a symbolic message, at least, about end-of-life care. Make it clear, indeed, what families are meant to do in their role as often decision makers at end of life, because that role is very unclear across the country, but particularly here in New South Wales. We need to set standards. We've been working with the standards setting organisation. I must say that the one that deals with standards for residential aged care has been extremely reluctant to set standards for management of dying in aged care settings. But the ACHS have been much more receptive to the idea that we should set some standards here. Dying safely, if we embrace that term, which I suggest we should, is a matter of systems of care and not individual treatments. So this is my conclusion. End-of-life management is complex. There are no easy solutions, but there are solutions. But there are no solutions that are not systems solutions and solutions which involve joint effort by various members and in particular, the connection between community and acute care, which is where all the action should be. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Peter. Our second speaker is Dr. Kate Robbins-Brown. Kate is a GP who's taken time off from practice to do a PhD, which I have the honour of co-supervising. And Kate is going to tell us a little bit about her PhD work. Thanks, Kate. Thank you very much, Kate. Our last speaker is Professor Michael Ashby. Michael is a professor at the University of Tasmania, where he's also Director of Palliative Care. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for this invitation, which occurs on the last day of Palliative Care Week. And I've got my Palliative Care Australia badge here, which says Palliative Care, everybody's business, and I'm sure we'd all agree about that. So I'm a palliative care physician. I've been involved in caring for dying people for the last 20 years in Adelaide, Melbourne, and now Hobart. And I see a few colleagues from those places in the room today, and it's great to catch up with you. I've been invited to share a few thoughts with you. The chair knows that I'm notoriously long-winded, and he's told me I absolutely have to stick to the 17 minutes, so I will. Some people think palliative care is a strange way of earning a living. In fact, my removal man, when we moved to Hobart, said I had the weirdest book collection he'd ever moved. On your left is the carving on the tomb of Bishop Edward Fox, Bishop of Winchester, Chancellor of England to Henry VII. And on your right is a cadaveric Buddha from 16th century Pakistan. Neither of these cultures at that time could have known one another, but they're both sending the same message. The first one is that in death we are all equal, on the left, and the one that both of them are doing is reminding us about our mortality and indicating that spiritual preparation for death is one of the most important things you can do. Preparation for death in 21st century Australia is problematical in our culture due to changes in religious adherence and worldview. We seem to understand quite well that it takes about 18 years to reach adulthood, or in the case of males, I'm sure the females in the room would say probably till about 35 or more. But there is no space for aging as decline and a process of dying over time. The work of Joanne Lynn, and you saw some of those slides in Dr. Saul's talk there about the way people deteriorate with chronic diseases now, that you have up to 2 years of deteriorating health, increasing disease burden, symptom control need, independence loss due to rising chronic disease in old age if you don't die suddenly. And that preparation for death is primarily about comfort and dignity, but ecological and economic dimensions are also absolutely unavoidable as secondary issues. The barriers to improving care and decision-making at the end of life are not, in my view, primarily medical. They arise from social, ethical, religious and political considerations of death and dying that are deeply embedded in our collective history, culture and politics. There are 3 attitudinal barriers, in my opinion, to the deployment of palliative care. And obviously, in order to deploy a model of care, you've actually got to decide that you're there and you need it. The first one is a reticence to initiate death talk. Don't talk to him about death, it will kill him. This is something clearly we need to work with. The idea that you have to do everything to maintain and prolong life, otherwise you're causing death. The idea that you can never give up on trying to cure a patient. And that the use of opioids and sedatives in palliative care can contribute to the cause of death. Some of the underpinning assumptions of palliative care are, first of all, the earth-shattering observation that dying is a natural part of living, an inevitable consequence of having life, and that no amount of medical progress will ever change this fact. Importantly, that we have no ethical or legal obligation to treat dying people as if they can be cured. And another observation is that grief and loss are an intrinsic part of life and an intrinsic part of medical practice. And I tell our students in year 1 that if they've made a decision to read medicine at university and become doctors, they've also made a conscious and an unconscious decision to work in the middle of loss. There are many studies that look at the notion of the good death. What do people want? if they can look at these things, which interestingly in most studies, if you really go into it, people after initial reticence are often very happy to participate in such studies. And this one talks about pain and symptom management as priorities, but it also says clear decision making. This was done in Chicago a few years ago by Nick Christakis' group. Preparation for death, completion of life, and affirmation of the whole person. Placing high priority on making contribution and decreasing family burden were important to people. Doctors emphasised the biomedical aspects, and so they should. They are the people who have one of the biggest areas of responsibility in this domain. But of course, if only the biomedical aspects are considered and the other things are lost, then things don't go at all well. These are just some brief data from a study we did of enduring guardianship forms, which are registrable in Tasmania with the Guardianship Board, the only jurisdiction in the country and one of the few in the world where this is the case. So we were able to access 1 in 20 of the lodged forms, and in 47% of them, unprompted, people have made a specific statement about a request for palliative care and good care when they were dying. I'm also much informed by the work of Alan Kelleher, an Australian sociologist who's been working in Britain and Canada over the last few years, and his idea that you can actually take the Ottawa Charter principles that we use to prolong and protect and save life to deal with death and dying as well. In other words, you need multimodal campaigns to get your message across to the community and also to hear what they have to say, a two-way street in which you reorientate the public space and public policy and practice to be more friendly to the end of life. And so we have in Tasmania an initiative called the Healthy Dying Initiative. When I originally asked our health minister to put this into one of her talks, the media department at the DHHS said the public weren't ready for it. And I said, well, that's the whole point of doing it. That dying is recognised, acknowledged and supported by all parts of the community and its services, that decision-making at the end of life is orientated towards timely and appropriate provision of palliative care for those who need it. And so we have a Goals of Care initiative, a form and a protocol and policy that has replaced NFR in the Royal Hobart Hospital. So you no longer have an NFR in order in our hospital, but every patient has a Goals of Care form filled out, and I'll show you that in a minute. We're also promoting advanced care planning and advanced directives, but without any notion that they're the panacea. And health promoting palliative care activities, promoting death awareness, death talk, health plays, talking to funeral directors, talking to the coroner, talking to service clubs, to anybody who'll listen to us, and listening as well as talking. So the Goals of Care plan is like a PULSE, a physician order for life-sustaining treatment form in the United States, which is a well-known concept there. And basically it asks clinicians, are you trying to cure the patient? Are you delivering palliative care? The patient is living with advancing disease and anticipating death, but some of the people on our program could be there for 1 to 2 years in an extreme example. Or are we in the terminal mode, and that means that we think you're going to die this week? That's the Liverpool Care Pathway window. So we ask clinicians to make a call. We ask clinicians to diagnose dying. We don't always get it right. Diagnoses are not always correct. But we find this framework works extremely well. It has a very high degree of acceptability in our medical community and also in the community in general. Obviously, it's incumbent upon you to then communicate that reality to the patient and the substitute decision maker, if appropriate. And this is just something I've been working on recently. It isn't validated, but it just basically says that diagnosing dying is a smorgasbord of observations of the patient, including disease progression, functional status, and various medical observations, which, if you put together, taken singularly, don't mean anything, but taken together, paint a picture of a dying person. The most powerful prognostic factor in my experience about dying is that the patient tells you themselves, or their relatives, or their nurses. People often ask us, and GPs have often asked me around advanced care planning, and trainees ask us how we go about doing communication. And my colleague Robin Thomas in Hobart and other colleagues around the country are working a lot with communication skills around end of life. First of all, I always go in by asking the patient and or the family what they understand to be the case. You don't lead in with information. You find out where they're at. You ask open questions, and one of the most powerful I have found is, how do you see your future? What do you see when you look into the future? And the first person I ever asked that in Adelaide said, I'm cactus. The conversation didn't need much more after that. A man I saw yesterday with a wife who was very confused and distressed and obviously dying of advanced breast cancer. I asked him what he saw, the future for his wife, and he said, and how he understood the situation rather, and he said, I don't know what's happening at the moment, I'm very confused, but I think I know where we're heading. Again, the conversation was much easier after that. And she died last night. What are the hopes and fears? John Cleese said in the film Clockwise, rushing to a meeting, and I shared this with one of my colleagues beforehand, that the despair he could take, it was the hope he couldn't stand. Fight and flight. Our patients, when they're talking to us, are often frightened. They are not in the mood for learning or taking on complex clinical information. Think about how you are when you were getting that critical exam result, or when you're in the medical frame yourself waiting for a biopsy result. We are non-linear. It's no good thinking that this is all logical, cold, clear decision-making. In the grief field, there's a thing called the dual process model, which is the most widely applied theoretical model of grief, which basically says you spend time crying, grieving, doing grief work, often in private, and then you go and get the kids from school. And that's how life is. You oscillate back and forth. And sometimes you're doing both things at the same time. And I see that all the time in our patients and families in our unit before death. Psychodynamics are very poor. Our practice is very poorly informed by projection, by transference, by countertransference, these theories that are well developed in psychotherapy. Michael Carroll, a distinguished psychotherapist who teaches clinical supervision, says that that which patients cannot tell us, they make us feel. And Donald Winnicott, the great British English child psychotherapist, talk about the notion of the good enough mother, the good enough death, and who holds the good enough mother, who holds the situation when there is despair, pain, loss, grief. All of these ingredients are essential. And we are dwelling in uncertainty nearly all the time. In fact, I think very few parts of our lives have any certainty in them at all. Uncertainty of prognosis, treatment outcomes, quality of life outcomes. And this is a huge contrast to prevailing approaches in modern life, which are positivistic, knowledge and outcomes based. Daniel Callahan, the former director of the Hastings Center in New York, said medicine can give us a longer life and a slower death. It can also keep us alive when we might be better off dead. And the philosopher Immanuel Kant said, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever built. And on that note, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And so thanks to the three speakers.
Excuse me, Paul. Just one moment. I apologise to all for interrupting. I've just had a few comments that some people have had difficulty with the technology and feeding questions through. I just wanted to intervene now. I just get a show of hands if anyone's had profound difficulty. Many questions have gone through and are being synthesised, but I just wanted to get a sense. So there's no...
So Rod, I haven't received any questions yet.
Right, well, that would appear to be a significant difficulty. Okay.
So it might be a long queue, as I say. I haven't received any yet.
Are you onto it? Okay, so there is a recycling process going on. Now, if you find that a question that's particularly relevant isn't coming up, I'm aware that they're assembled at the back, then we'll have to fall back to a paper sort of mechanism. Now, My own view is that it's a very important and interesting session that we're having, and particularly if we started a little bit late, and if there is difficulty, I just seek leave of conference that we might extend the session for some 10 minutes over what's been on the agenda. There's no profound objection to that, so I'll just leave you with that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Rod. So we've got a censorship mechanism up here that filters everything you say, and finally it'll get through to it. So while we're waiting, perhaps we'll get the discussion underway. I'd like to start, or go, from the very beginning, talk about the philosophical basis and how important that is. Each of the speakers have drawn attention to the assumptions that are often involved in this area, and Kate particularly took on the question of autonomy and the sense of an individual identity in opposition to what she calls a relational identity. And I think both Michael and Peter would agree with that. Perhaps I can just ask, maybe Kate, you can start. How important is it for us to clarify what our philosophical starting points are when, as clinicians, we address these kinds of issues?
Well, I think it's very important, and I guess it's difficult because obviously clinical medicine is a practice, and so people tend to think, well, I'm in practice, I'm doing it a certain way. What does it matter what the kind of theory underpinning that is? Yet I think if we don't recognise the theory that underpins what we do, then we don't recognise the assumptions and limitations of those theories. And there is obviously no complete theory. There's never going to be a theoretical answer to these kind of questions. Every theory has limitations and assumptions embedded within it. But if we don't recognise those, then we can't practice well. And so even if you're going to kind of use a kind of more autonomy model because that's kind of fits better with your understanding, and I think we tend to be attracted to theories that fit with the way we see the world anyway. I think if you don't kind of look at that and kind of think about, well, what are the gaps in this, then that's when we often run into conflict with people, because I think people's understandings, when other people understand things, have a different kind of understanding, they are often using a different theoretical model, even if they're using it unconsciously. And often our conflicts are around right at that very deep theoretical level. And once again, if you don't recognise that, then you're just kind of trying to kind of fix it up on top at a very superficial level, and you kind of can't see why you're not making any progress.
Peter.
I tried to write a paper with an ENT surgeon about our philosophical stances, those of us who might see ourselves as deontologists, or those of us who think of ourselves as utilitarians. And we sent it off to the journal, and they sent it out to their panel of reviewers, and we got this mystified letter back saying nobody had the faintest idea what you were talking about, and we can't possibly publish that. So while I appreciate what Kate's saying, I think we have to reduce that to a very workable level. And I had dinner recently with a wonderful surgeon called Grant Gillette in New Zealand, in Dunedin, and he said, really all you have to be able to do is justify what you're thinking, justify what you're saying. You have to have a justification. And that's an absolutely irreducible minimum. So if you're going to say something, you have to be able to justify that. And that's as philosophical sometimes as it can get.
So you don't need to talk in arcane philosophical language. You just need to get the ideas clear for yourself.
I think it's, I'm sure everybody would agree. I think it's important we don't talk in arcane philosophical language.
Thanks. Michael?
I think theory is something that we retrofit to life. I think the concept of autonomy is clearly central to medical and healthcare practice, and I'm very glad that that's the case. As an English liberal, and I do stress English liberal, nothing to do with the Liberal Party of Australia, that's not a Liberal Party, but as an English liberal, to me, the sovereignty of the individual is the most important thing, and the only time it should be messed with is if I'm infringing the liberty or interests of another person. And that's my principle in life, and that's why I'm a liberal. And that's why I support autonomy as a concept. However, in medical practice, and certainly in palliative care, I put it to you, when you're the sickest you've ever felt in your life, what price philosophical concepts of your autonomy? I think that what we see in practice is that whilst the concept and operationalizing it is important, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on around your social context in the world, and that cannot be ignored. Also, we may talk about patients' wishes, but there is also clinical reality. And my job is to help people to find a balance between the two. And the work that we do is often grief work around the fact that there is no more treatment aimed at cure, and it's not what the person wants, but it's what's going to happen. Reality.
Okay, thank you. Now, I still haven't received any questions up here. Perhaps they could be conveyed to me on paper. Kate, perhaps I could just, thank you. Perhaps I could just follow up with one additional question. You placed a lot of emphasis on trust and the dialogue between the various participants in the end-of-life decision-making process. What happens when there isn't trust? What happens when the relationships are not genuinely supportive, but there are conflictual relationships? And that often happens within a family.
I mean, I guess that's what a lot of the current framework is premised on, the idea that people have conflicted relationships. And I guess the fact of the matter is probably there are going to be very few perfectly functional families out there. It's recognising that once again, I guess the dysfunctional family and the dysfunctional relationships occur along a spectrum, and that we shouldn't be too quick to assume that we are in a better position to decide, that we know the patient better. Nelson and Nelson have a lovely book called The Patient in the Family, and they kind of raise these ethical points around the nature of family. And one of the things they raise is that the family can't be replaced by better qualified people. And I guess that's been very influential in the way I've thought about it. That obviously if a family is abusive or truly harmful, well then yes, they can't be involved in decision making. But we tend to label families, very, very, very quick to label families. A lot of research showing that doctors and nursing staff tend to be very mistrustful of family involvement and see the family as kind of interfering. And once again, that's why the theory matters, because that tends to come from an individualistic understanding of autonomy and the idea that when the family's involved, they're somehow influencing the people unduly, rather than thinking, well, actually, this person might have always made decisions in the context of their family. And so I think it's very important to recognise that the kind of intimacy that exists within families, even though it's imperfect in probably 99% of families, we're not really in a position to replace that with our kind of expertise and our objective kind of viewpoint, because this isn't an objective kind of decision.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a few of these questions now, and some of them have brought on the discussion we've just had, which is good. One of the comments was that there might be different emphases on the concept of autonomy depending on culture and background and age and so on, and it may well be that for the younger generation this is more important than for the older generation. And some other people have asked about the complexity or variability of the interplay between the people involved, and that maybe we need to think about who the best decision supporters or surrogates might be. So I'll ask you to comment on that, but perhaps in the broader context of what the issues are that we're seeking to determine here. What are the issues that come up in relation to death? Now, both Michael and Kate spoke about the nature of the different meanings of death, and Peter said how the meaning lives on for the people who follow. I wonder if you could address this sense of what the meaning of death is, and what's the kind of field of questions that we're trying to address here. Peter, maybe you can start.
Yeah, well, referring to something that Michael said, so hopefully he'll pick up on it himself, but death is not primarily a medical event. And I think that's been the big shift in 50 years, is that it's gone to being so. And that we have to push back, because it isn't. And I remember the pivotal moment when you couldn't write old age on a death certificate. Do you all remember that? I don't know. I'm not sure when that happened. But when that happened, it meant that everybody was forced to die of something other than the natural process of dying. We had to invent something that they died of. And by definition, that was something reversible. So therefore, death became a much more contested notion when you couldn't actually die of old age. So I do think that we've reached a point where there's almost a conspiracy to medicalize death. I actually feel like families are finding the medicalization of death quite convenient as well. And that on many occasions, as an intensivist, I've really been cornered by families into making it my issue, when in fact they haven't done an ACAT assessment, they've got no plans, the wife's demented in another hospital. A whole heap of things haven't been dealt with in the community, but then it's an issue of 87-year-old and how come I can't fix him. So I think medicalization of dying has actually worked for people. So I do think that pushing back and actually acknowledging that death is not primarily a medical event, as Michael said, would be one of the really key things to bring into the discussion.
Michael?
I don't think the patients I serve could give two hoots what I think about the meaning of death. I guess, though, by sitting in that space for a lot of my professional life, we do pick up some themes, some observations. The dominant view, I'd say, in the Australian communities I served is a fairly existentialist view of the world, a sense that when you die, that's it, including people who have formal religious adherence and faith. Relatively little talk about the afterlife, and I confirmed this with our pastoral care worker who said it does happen, but it isn't much talked of. A sense of humour, that Australians, like most people, will laugh at the things they find most difficult. I mean, I'll just give you an example. The other day I went into a man's room and he had a big St Kilda scarf tied to the bed, and I said, I guess you must have high hopes this season. And he said, no. I said, I don't think I'm going to see it in my lifetime. And yesterday I was involved with a man, a relative, a son, who was about 8 foot tall, covered in tats. If you met him in a bar, you'd be terrified. He said, but this is my mum. She's my sun, my moon, my stars. She's been everything to me. She took me back in when I came out of jail. And now I've got an engineering qualification. I'm going to work in the Northern Territory. It's all down to her. And I don't know what the bloody hell to do, mate. I can't do anything for her. What do I do?
I mean, I guess, dying means different things, obviously, to different people. And I guess, as was alluded to in the question, there's kind of cross-culturally different understandings of dying. And I think one of the things, like Peter said, in some ways, is the medicalisation of dying can be linked to also this idea of having control of death and control of health. And once again, I guess that comes back to the notion of autonomy, which isn't just autonomy in medicine. It's, as Michael alluded to, the whole Western liberal notion of autonomy, which is deeply embedded in our cultural and political system. And the idea that taking control of something is seen as very important. It's how you kind of show that you're a responsible person, a kind of morally acceptable person takes control of things. They have responsibility for their health, and we ask people to have more and more responsibility for their health in many ways. And I think advanced care planning can be seen as a shift towards asking people to also take control of their dying. And, and I'm not just saying that from a medical perspective, there's also a kind of entire kind of cultural perspective around people narrating their own story and then narrating their own death. The problem is the extent to which that becomes a moral imperative, so that people who don't wish to participate in that are kind of labelled as being kind of morally blameworthy because they're not doing that, when really what they're expressing is a different understanding of what dying means to them. And I think that's why we need to kind of be open to those different meanings.
Perhaps we can shift the discussion to some more practical questions. And I'd like to ask, maybe starting with Peter, what's the kind of parameters that are available to us? What's available to us in terms of the actual possibilities for making decisions? And interestingly, both Kate and Michael referred to this idea of a good enough decision. We don't have to get it absolutely right. There's no right answer that we can prove is correct. But what is it that we're seeking to achieve? Peter?
It's a good question. I don't know whether the chair would allow me to do this, but could I get them to imagine this for themselves a little bit? I want you to imagine you're in a restaurant and your partner has rung and said, I'm running 10 minutes late, can you order for me? Now, what you know about your partner is she's a little bit overweight, or he, and has a slightly high cholesterol and a penchant for double bacon cheeseburgers. And now here's your question. Do you order her a green salad, a double bacon cheeseburger, or some ugly compromise in between? And the point of the exercise, to save the time of you going through it, is really the crux of the issue that I think all of us are saying, is this is about making decisions for other people on many occasions, and on what basis do we now do that? The proposition that we act to order the green salad and do something that's in their best interests doesn't feel right. Ordering a double bacon cheeseburger, which is what she'd want, doesn't feel right. We have to come up with some system whereby the decision that we make feels authentic for that person. And authenticity is often a word that's now used to try and describe that. How could that decision be better informed and more consistent with the narrative or the journey that that person's on? And I'm sure that that's a slightly complex way of thinking of it, but it's actually not about trying to decide what they would have wanted for themselves. That's not sufficient, unfortunately.
I think this concept of control is very important, because I think it's deeply, deeply flawed. When people tell me I'm a control freak, I mean, to say they're a control, I really worry. I think it's a, you know, as if it's a good thing, because I don't think it is. I'd like to quickly read you something from Michael Ignatieff, who's a historian who led the opposition in the last election in Canada. Very smart guy. Wrote a book called Scar Tissue about his mother's dying of dementia. The real problem is what we're to think of death. People like us who live by the values of self-mastery are not especially good at dying, at submitting to biological destiny. The modern problem is not death without religious consolation, without an afterlife. The problem is that death makes the modern secular religion of self-development and self-improvement appear senseless. We're addicted to a vision of life as narrative which we compose as we go along. In fact, we didn't have anything to do with the beginning of the story. We're merely allowed to dabble with the middle, and the end is mostly not up to us at all, but to genetics, biological fate, and chance.
Kate, that probably leads well into...
Well, I guess that makes me think of something else, which is that to an extent we can't control our own story, and it's a myth to think we can, but we can control what we say about it. And that's what Arthur Frank's work. He's a Canadian sociologist and medical sociologist, and he kind of speaks a lot about the fact that the way we tell our stories and the way we listen to stories, those are moral acts. And so a lot of what goes on for people is outside of their control. They don't have choices over the diseases they get, the kind of bodies they have, the kind of time and place they live in, but they have a choice about the story they tell. And I think that's a really important thing. We have a choice about how we listen to their stories, and our listening is a very important moral responsibility.
Okay, look, I'd like to stick with this a bit more. And Peter, I think your idea of authenticity is really, really helpful here. And Kate talked about, in her talk, about the contextual nature of the decision. It's not just what matters in general, but it's what matters for this patient at this time with this kind of relationship. I wonder, since your work, or much of your focus, Peter, is on the idea of advanced care planning and directives and so on, how do we work that into the process of documentation?
I guess one of the issues, I mean, I work in acute care exclusively, and that's no good place for doing advanced care planning. That's the payoff. That's where advanced care planning comes home to roost. And the responsibility there is translational. So if people have written or appointed somebody and given them instructions or done any of the legally available options, the real issue in acute care is to translate that into something intelligible to an acute care system. And this is where the goals of care document that Michael was introduced in Tasmania becomes really valuable, because what you want is to inform your resuscitation decision-making in the acute care setting with something tangible that you can actually say, well, this represents a view from the patient or their family that we can take into account. And we're just in the process of designing a statewide form for New South Wales as well, which echoes and is somewhat informed by the form that Michael's using. So from an acute care viewpoint, that's what I think matters. From a community viewpoint, I think the engagement is the question here. We did focus groups with GPs in my own town, and they were, to use a phrase I had to make up, constructively negative. That is to say, they weren't prepared to do it, but they were prepared to talk about why. So that was kind of interesting, and all sorts of issues came up about reimbursement and Medicare reimbursement for these sorts of activities, which isn't really there and hasn't really been recognized. And I think that from a community viewpoint, you do have to see the GPs as being the real focus of that effort.
Could I slightly disagree with that? Well, not the emphasis there on acute care. I think we do need to do advanced directives in acute hospitals, because a lot of these people are bouncing in and out. It may be quite late in the piece, but I don't think it's ever too late to do advanced care planning, because there's usually one more admission to come. And often these people are, as they say in a hospital, frequent flyers. They're coming in and out of the hospital, and the discussion that the bit of paper can actually engender is the important thing. It's not so much the directive. It's the discussion with clinicians, the discussion with self first, the discussion with family and those close to you, and discussion with clinical staff. So we've actually got a medical director in our state who thinks that you shouldn't be doing it in hospitals, and I profoundly disagree. I think we should do it wherever it's material to do it, but not have the hope that it's going to solve everything, but as a vehicle for discussion and thought.
Do you want to add anything?
And I guess in terms of GPs being involved in these discussions, I mean, there's a lot of research showing that doctors have a lot of reluctance to engage in these discussions in all kind of different types of practice. There's a lot of barriers to this. And I think time is one, reimbursement is another, but the other is potentially, once again, this kind of different understanding of what should be involved. And so kind of when it becomes kind of a very structured, you know, you have to have had this kind of discussion along these kind of lines, that can become very difficult for people if GPs are conceptualising it as refound in terms of kind of knowing and not knowing relationships. And also the idea that as a GP, and I'm sure all the GPs in the room will agree, GPs are in the wonderful position of being seen as ideally situated to do everything. And, you know, if there's research suggesting that if GPs followed every clinical guideline for every patient, they'd be doing 7 hours a day per patient just in implementing the guidelines. And there's a kind of concept of, you know, generalism as a kind of way of understanding general practice, which says that general practice is about the biotechnical, but also the biographical knowledge of the patient. And that's really the GP's, one of the GP's strengths, is that kind of being able to see not just what the guideline says you should do for this person, but actually knowing this person and then being able to put that into the context of everything else about that person. And I think that that's why when GPs get kind of told to do stuff, sometimes they can dig their heels in a bit, and don't blame them.
So many of the questions which, and I've had various devices and they've all crashed every time I've started to look at them, but many of the questions I've been able to pick up have focused on practical issues about what doctors actually should do here. Michael, this is your thing, this is what you were talking about. But it's clear that people need guidance, don't they, about how to handle these questions, and there's a certain amount of discomfort about how what we're expected to do in this setting. Michael, what are your rules of thumb in giving advice, particularly to junior doctors in this area?
Well, if it's to junior doctors, the first thing I'd say is we shouldn't lay all the responsibility on them, and that's why in our goals of care form we've tried to ensure that below the level of resident they don't actually fill them out at all, and that they should be assisted in those conversations. And there was a wonderful paper by Brendan Murphy, the CEO of the Austin, who was Chief Medical Officer at St V's when I was there about in 2008, where he really lambasted us, didn't he, the profession, said, come on, you heads of units, you need to take leadership on this. I certainly think this is a very important area for general practice. I completely concur with the notion that you guys get everything put in your in-tray with very high expectations and limited resources and time to do it. But this is one area where, you know, I'm concerned that from the hospital side of things, because I actually spend most of my week in acute care, like you, down at the Royal, on the consult service, and I think my impression overall is that GPs are losing a brokerage and kind of direction of the traffic role in a lot of their patients because they're spending so much time in hospital. And whether we like it or not, 60 to 80% of Australians die in a hospital. And sometimes it doesn't go too badly, but obviously there's a whole lot of decision making that could be done in primary care. I'm certainly seeing, because it's mandated now in nursing homes, in residential aged care, GPs are getting very involved in that, and that's great. But there was a study about 15 years ago that showed that patients were least likely to talk about death and dying to their doctors. They were much more likely to talk to a nurse, to a funeral director, to a financial planner or a lawyer. And I think that says something about the dynamic we have with patients on this issue. Maybe they think that we're always there to save their lives.
Thank you. Kate, what are your take-home messages for practicing doctors in this area?
I guess my take-home message would be about trying to engage in dialogue, trying to be aware of what it means to you, but then being willing to see what it means to other people, and being willing to look at people in the context of their family relationships. And one of the ways that you can kind of help families make decisions is by shifting the emphasis away from what the patient wants, which, as Peter beautifully illustrated with the hamburger thing, is quite a hard way to kind of think about it. And to start thinking about, well, if this person has been in your family has a story aside from the story of each individual member. And so how do you see this kind of story for your family, and recognising that families aren't obliged to give everything to the achieving ends for a single member. We don't expect them to do that when somebody's well. We don't expect families to sacrifice every member for the advancement of one member, and they shouldn't be required to do that when people are sick either. I don't think we expect them to do that, but I think that often they somehow expect that of themselves. And so trying to make that clear that let's think about your family story and where your family story is going from here, and how you've made decisions in the past and how that can guide you in resolving this problem.
Just to pick up on Kate's last point was the only take-home I was going to suggest, which has been working for me, which is to ask the family how they normally make decisions. It's a very good one for culturally and linguistically diverse groups as well. How does your family normally make a decision is a very useful leading question, as well as asking what do you know already. That's actually a useful strategy.
Michael, you talked about how there's a need to change the language, at least in some respect, to get rid of expressions like NFR or DNR or whatever. What's the process of changing a culture here? What is the process of actually developing these kinds of skills? Is this something we need to take into consideration in medical education in the universities, or is it something that should be part of a mandatory, compulsory, continuing education processes? Or how do you see the challenge here?
Certainly, I think just about every university will have some content on this now in their medical school. We certainly work very hard on this in years 1 and 2. What have you come to medical school for? If you think you come to cure everybody, you better go home now, because that's not the world you're going to be graduating into. It's nice when it happens, and obviously it's your core responsibility as a doctor, but you're going to spend most of your time dealing with an aging population and chronic diseases unless you do pediatrics. I think the modern communication skills, we hear a lot about this, and sometimes it feels a bit formulaic, but there's now evidence that shows that you can learn throughout your career to improve your communication skills and to focus them on specific tasks. So if any of you are interested in this, just Google OncoTalk, look for a guy called James Tulsky at Duke, or the group at Cambridge University, and NephroTalk now, these are how to initiate difficult conversations with people about limitation of medical treatment. A model conversation for a GP would be something like this. You're seeing a patient who's come out of the Royal. It was your 3rd admission this year for COPD. How do you see the future of this? What do you think we should do next time? And then as a result of that, often there is a tool that could actually help to make sure that if I'm not around, or I'm not the one sending you to hospital, that the hospital would know what you want. So we could do an advanced directive together. Or one of our nurse practitioners or practice nurses could do it, or whatever resource you have. If a patient is in a nursing home or in a private hospital, then the goals of care structure is a framework. What are we trying to do? I don't think we're trying to cure you anymore. Does that sit with where you see it? Obviously, all of this requires intuition. You have to know where the patient's at, and sometimes it's going to go wrong. But the risks are where all therapy is risk. Just like all medicine is risk, there is nothing we do that doesn't risk. I think we need to take the risk to do death talk with people. And maybe it's because we don't take the risks, that's why people don't necessarily choose us as the logical people to talk about end of life with.
And believe it or not, there's an app by those very people who do Unquote Talk. It's called Vital Talk. I think it's 99 cents. It's really well worth it, actually, even if you're already good at communicating.
It's well worth the 99 cents.
It's good value for 99 cents.
And revalidation in the UK mandates now for oncologists, they have to do this. You have to do communication skills, and you're never too old to learn, is the message.
We'll have to wrap up soon, but what's the role? Clearly, you three are experts in this area, and you provide specialty assistance for working GPs or people who work in other specialties. What are the kinds of resources and assistance that people can call upon? Michael, perhaps you can start with that. What's the role of specialists in this area, or is this an area where we all simply have to be specialists?
To give you my phone number and ring up if you want advice, if you want to share ideas, refer a patient, or just talk about what you're going to do. Very happy to do that. And to be honest, it's a resource that isn't used enough. If I get a call from a GP, I will drop whatever I can reasonably drop and go straight to it and take it. And it's one of the more pleasurable aspects of my job, is to work with colleagues, to support them, and to explore difficult situations and see if we can be of help. We don't know everything, and after 20 years in this game, you come to realize also that the big challenge is actually not death, it's your own death. It's a personal thing.
And we'll give you all Michael's mobile number a little bit later. Kate and Peter, would you like to talk about that question of the extent to which this should be seen as a specialty, and what the resources are that we should be cultivating in the community?
Well, I think to an extent it's a specialty in that everything's a specialty, to know, to have a kind of grip on all that's going on within it. But at the same time, and I think ethics is a very interesting kind of specialty, in that in Australia we kind of encourage each doctor to kind of be responsible for their own ethical conduct. And we don't have a lot of ethics consultants or clinical ethics committees compared to, say, in the States. And I actually think that's a good thing, because I think it's not a good idea to kind of enter into the thing and go, oh, the ethics consultant will come and take care of the ethics, like the, nephrologist is going to come and take care of their kidneys. At the same time, I think if we're going to have that approach, we need more explicit ethics education, because although we recognise ethics, we have ethics kind of integrated into the curriculum at undergraduate levels, and in the RACGP curriculum, it's one of the domains, yet we don't get much explicit theory education, knowledge of the different theories. So then people don't actually have the tools to work with to kind of work it out. We don't expect people to kind of know everything else instinctively, yet because ethics is sometimes kind of seen as equivalent to conscience, we kind of expect people to just know.
Okay, just one last question. Someone has drawn attention to the fact that the federal government has allocated $10 million for progress in this area. How should the $10 million be spent? Peter?
I think that we badly need to harmonise our legislation. I don't know whether they're going to spend money on doing so. I do think that we need some resources that are user-friendly for people to actually consult. The more this becomes a specialty, the more badly served our patients will be. So we've got to get it out there. I would recommend to those of you in New South Wales, at least, that you go to a website called planningaheadtools.com.au. Planning Ahead Tools is an adult learning site, and it uses video clips and stuff. It's actually quite easy to use. But I think they should spend their money on initiatives that decentralize the notion of caring for people who are dying and don't provide further centralization to that.
Michael, do you want to comment on that?
I would put an advanced care planning or advanced directive officer in each major hospital around the country, like they have in Victoria, with an educative role and linked to the palliative care service. And I think there's been some good evidence that works well. I guess the other thing I'd say is that death per se is not an ethical issue. It may have ethical content, but it's not an ethical dilemma. It just is. And that's the key message from my point of view. It's everybody's business.
Thanks, Kate.
And I guess I wouldn't spend the money on trying to increase advanced directive completion or advanced directive uptake, because I don't think that's really the answer. I would try and kind of encourage people to have more dialogue and to really make time for that in hospitals, and that's where I would do it, is kind of more tweaking at the edges, so that in general practice, but also in hospitals, when the kind of crisis point comes, people still, even if they've talked about it beforehand, still need an opportunity to think it through again, and trying to actually make time for that there is, I think, would make a big difference.
Thank you. This will bring this session to a close. I've tried to synthesise the questions that I did manage to receive. I hope people are not too disappointed with the way that came out, but I think this was a really interesting discussion. Professor Ian Maddox, who is one of the great figures in the development of palliative care in Australia, had a motto which might be useful for this session. He said the principle of acute care is don't just stand there, do something, whereas the principle for palliative care is don't just do something, stand there. And I think that may well represent one of the key messages that come through from this discussion. So I'd like to thank Peter Saul, Kate Robbins-Brown and Michael Ashby for wonderful presentations and a terrific discussion, and thank you all for your participation.
Good. Thank you very much, and I thank the chairman of the session. I'd advise there is a presentation for each of the speakers that we'll do, and on behalf of the President, I'll invite the speakers to join us for morning tea, which is just in the rooms next door. I take the opportunity as I adjourn the standing orders for the morning tea break. Please remember to visit our sponsors who are located in the room. Remember, they're here to help us to help our members. And I'll resume the meeting at 11:05. And as I said, we'll hear from Professor Julian Raitt, and then we'll move into the tabled urgency motion from yesterday. Thank you very much.